Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 29 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Seattle Kraken, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1. So the Sharks' first ever game in franchise history against the NHL's newest team, the Seattle Kraken, and it does not really go as well as they had hoped for with this 3-1 loss. Kind of similar to how in the 17-18 season with the arrival of the Vegas Golden Knights, the Sharks struggled versus them. They're struggling here, at least in this first game, against Seattle. Now, there is obviously a massive difference between how Seattle has played this year and how Vegas did in their first year. You could argue whether or not it was the other teams around the league handling the Seattle expansion draft better than they handled the Vegas expansion draft, or Seattle themselves handling the expansion draft worse than how Vegas handled it. But in the end, the fact remains that Seattle is nowhere near as good as Vegas were in their first year, but it was enough to beat the Sharks here tonight. And this one starts off in the first period completely goalless. While I would say the ice was definitely tilted towards Seattle, it would still end up being 20 minutes of very, very quick action. 15 minutes in this first 20-minute period actually went by without a whistle interrupting it. So this was a very fast game in general. And by the end of the first period, the game was still tied at 0. Second period would be very similar, though this time the Sharks would have the ice slightly tilted towards them. But the point is that after 40 minutes, this game was scoreless. Though it should be noted that this was not without a lack of chances. The Sharks had a couple of opportunities to score in this game. One of them was by Matt Nieto, whose shot ends up getting scooped right off the goal line by Adam Larson to keep that game tied at 0. Otherwise, the Sharks would have had a lead and we could have been talking about a completely different game. But instead, we went into a final third period of this game with a game tied at 0, and it felt as though with how closely checked this game actually was, that it could very well come down to one bounce going the other way. And you could say that that's sort of what ended up happening, as the first goal of the game tonight was scored by, funnily enough, former Sharks player Ryan Donato, as he takes, I guess, a sort of a shot from in front of the net, but it ends up deflecting off the skate of Radim Shemek, and he deflects it into his own net, and thus it was 1-0 Seattle. A few minutes later, it would be Brandon Tanev who would be able to score onto James Reimer, because Mario Ferraro would collide with Reimer as he fell over, and thus it was 2-0 Seattle. The Sharks would actually cut the lead in half with a Logan Couture goal with the goalie pulled, which would actually, interestingly enough, be the Sharks' first goal this season with the 6-on-5 with the goaltender pulled in the last couple of minutes. But it would not end up being enough. Yarncroke would get the empty netter to make it 3-1 Seattle, and that would do it for the game. Basically, this is kind of a consequence that's going to come when the Sharks continuously play this style, right? It's a kind of a necessary evil if you're going to go around like this. So for instance, in the previous game against the Dallas Stars, I talked about how it was a very stereotypical San Jose Sharks game. They didn't score a lot of goals, they played pretty solid defensively, and they got good goaltending. And in that one, they got the bounces necessary, like the one off of Tomas Hertl to score that first goal of that game, and they ended up winning 2-1. Here tonight, again, pretty stereotypical Sharks game. They played solid defensively. James Reimer was very good in nets. They didn't score a lot of goals, but sometimes the hockey gods look upon you differently, like they do from one game to another. And in this time, the Sharks, if you at least discount the empty net goal, they lose it 2-1 instead of winning it 2-1 like they did against Dallas. You know, if you're not going to be a high-scoring team, if you're not going to be a team that's really just taking it to their opponents, yes, you can do this type of style better than other teams and win games more often than not. However, no team is going to be able to consistently game in and game out win these types of one-goal games, and this is just one of them that kind of doesn't go the Sharks' way. To move on to talking about the players here, the first line, if you still want to call them that, Gregor, Couture, and Dahlin. These three players did not end up together for the entirety of the game. Come third period, when the Sharks were actually looking for some offense, we saw the Meyer, Hertl, and Dahlin line reunited to try and spark something there. But prior to that, the Couture, Gregor, Dahlin line I don't think was necessarily too bad. They didn't necessarily generate a ton of chances either, but I'd say each of these players were independently good in this game, or at least independently good enough in this game. And so while they haven't really figured it out as an entire trio, as an entire line just yet, with a few more games, maybe some sort of chemistry can be developed with these three players. On to the second line with Meier, Hertl, and Barabanov. If you had seen the start of this game, you would say, wow, this must have been far and away the Sharks' best line here tonight. But it's kind of hard to say if that's actually the case, because in that first period, the period where the Seattle Kraken had the majority of the possession, this was the only line for the Sharks that actually did much of anything. Almost pretty much the only line for the Sharks that did pretty much anything in this game. And particularly, it was Timo Meier who stood out in such a positive light. Meier was absolutely lights out in that first period, and he was kind of carrying Tomas Hertl and Barabanov on his back for that first period. However, come second and come third period, Meier kind of slowed down a bit, and Hertl and Barabanov never necessarily really picked up the slack. And as such, while the second line was really good in that first period, the second and third period left a bit to be desired for those three players. Like I said, Meier and Hertl ended up getting joined by Dahlin in that third period, and that line never really did a ton. Though I should note that Dahlin in particular, even though he ended up on that third line and didn't do a ton with them, still looked quite solid. The third line was maybe the most interesting line of the night, because there were actually some solid offensive opportunities coming from this line, and in particular Matt Nieto. Like I said, he had the opportunity that was swept off the goal line by Adam Larsson. I believe it was in the second period. But otherwise, this line was actually generating a few chances, and this seems like the first time since the 18-19 season, when the Sharks had that third line of Thornton, Sorensen, and LeBanc, that I can actually be confident that a Sharks third line will play at the very least a pretty good game. Now, I'm not necessarily comparing these three players, Bonino, Nieto, and Cogliano, to that third line back in 18-19, because obviously the 18-19 Sharks team was so deep, had such forward depth, that third line was still better than the vast majority of the rest of the league's third lines. This third line is not necessarily having those same types of accolades, and is not going to be scoring at a same clip as the Thornton, LeBanc, Sorensen line did those 3 years ago. However, it is a line still that you can expect that more often than not, each game, they're going to be able to outplay the other team's third line. At least you could hope that they're not going to get outplayed themselves. And finally, when it comes to the fourth line, we of course had Lane Peterson return to the lineup because of the injury that is potentially long-term with Kevin LeBanc. Now, there was an interesting call-up made by the San Jose Sharks prior to this game when they brought up Jaden Halbegowitz from the San Jose Barracuda, and I thought he might actually make his debut. I was rather excited by that, but instead the Sharks default over to Lane Peterson, a familiar face here who still has yet to score a point in this year. I believe he's played 15 or 16 games at this point. And the fourth line, they did actually have one good chance. I'll give it to Lane Peterson in particular. He did have a great chance to score, but this one gets swept near the goal line at the very least by Jamie Alexiak. But otherwise, the fourth line, they weren't awful, but they definitely didn't really generate much of anything. So if we are to go into this next game on Thursday, I would definitely be interested to see some sort of new face on that fourth line, whether that is Halbegowitz or whoever. I think the Sharks need a fourth line changeup. I've been saying this for many games now because it just hasn't done anything for the Sharks at all. On to the defensive side of things, we of course have Ferraro and Burns leading the way on the first defensive pairing, the two players who are always leaned on the most. I thought Burns actually had a very solid game for himself, made a couple of nice offensive plays, wasn't too bad defensively. In general, like I said earlier on, the Sharks played a really solid defensive game. They only actually ended up giving up 2 goals in this game, and one of them was a very unlucky chance. The thing about Mario Ferraro, his pair in tonight's game, he's the one who ends up making, I guess you could say, the misplay on the game-winning goal by Brandon Tanev, where he tries to go and support Brent Burns, who's trying to cover his man down the left side, or at least the right side if you look at it from Reimer's perspective, instead of covering Brandon Tanev. And in the end, Ferraro, because he does this, he trips, he falls over, he crashes into Reimer, which allows for a very easy tap-in goal from Brandon Tanev. So something where it's just Mario Ferraro, you love the effort that he puts in, night out, he leads the league in block shots, yada, yada, yada. But that particular decision was not made correctly, and it ended up costing the Sharks this game. Of course, like I said earlier, when you're playing these low-scoring games, it can really come down to just a couple of specific moments, and that was one of them. On to the second pairing of Middleton and Karlsson. I was once again pretty impressed by this pairing. Karlsson, I don't think was necessarily as superb as he was in the previous one against Dallas. There were a couple of small defensive errors, though certainly nothing major, but I liked his offensive game once again, was making some solid reads, was making some great passes, and just generally, while his point streak did not actually continue here tonight, and he wasn't continuing to get goal after goal, it seemed, each game here tonight either, it was still a very impressive performance from Erik Karlsson. You can't necessarily expect him to put up a point in every single game that he does play, but he definitely played well enough to get a point if the Sharks maybe had slightly better luck here tonight. When it comes to the third pairing of Šimek and Vlasic, they once again actually looked rather solid. Šimek was just seemingly all over the Seattle Kraken here tonight. Not necessarily all over the puck, but he was just laying hit after hit. I believe he ended up with over 10 hits here tonight against Seattle, which I guess you could say is rather impressive. Yes, it also says that he doesn't necessarily have a ton of possession of the puck, because if you're the team having to lay those hits, it means the other team actually has the puck. But still, hockey can be a war of attrition at times, and so to be able to continuously lay the body, it makes players think twice about trying to make specific plays, because they know they're going to end up getting punished by that big physical force, and so they sometimes make less optimal plays to avoid getting crushed into the boards like Šimek was doing every single minute seemingly of tonight's game and on every single shift he had. So still very solid game from Šimek. I assume this will be enough to continue to keep him in the lineup. It seems as though Bob Booner, I guess the second or third wake-up call that he gave to Šimek this season by healthy scratching him once again, has really done the trick here. And finally, when it comes to the Sharks' goaltending, James Reimer once again tonight was very, very solid. Yes, he ends up losing this game, but he only lets in 2 goals. The first one from Donato, he had absolutely zero chance on. And the second one from Tanev, he had pretty much no chance on either, since his own player ended up colliding with him. So a pretty rough night for James Reimer, where he didn't really have much of a chance on the 2 goals he gave in, and then the Sharks only scored 1 as goal support for him, so he ends up getting the loss anyway. But he can still be proud that his stats remain quite pristine. He still looks very good, and I suspect that James Reimer should absolutely, especially with the stretch of games that Adin Hill had when Reimer was injured, that Reimer will absolutely be in the nets for the following game. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on the Vancouver Canucks, a team that has been absolutely on fire since they made a coaching change. They brought in Bruce Boudreau, who has had a lot of success in his coaching career with teams like the Minnesota Wild, the Anaheim Ducks, and the Washington Capitals, and seemingly is trying to do the very same thing with a Vancouver Canucks team that prior to this winning streak that they've had were just kind of completely lost when Travis Green was at the helm. So the Sharks will have their hands full. As I said, the Canucks have yet to lose a game with him behind the bench. We'll see if the Sharks can change that. Class dismissed.